All right. So then today we're gonna keep it like purely conversational. We're gonna ask like a couple questions to begin with, and then after that, it's gonna just flow into wherever the conversation directs us. So Vineet, you wanna take over?
Yeah. So we want to start off with like your career, and when you were involved in international relations as a diplomat. So could you talk a little bit about your experience as an ambassador to the Economic and Social Council, within the United Nations, and some of your experiences working with other diplomats, from around the world?
Sure, sure. Well, really among the best elements of working as a U.S. ambassador at the UN in New York or in Geneva is that many of the countries send their very best diplomats to those two venues. So you really have your colleagues are among the best diplomats in the world, and because for many countries who don't really have the opportunity to have the kind of influence that the United States has, playing inside of the United Nations and really making that work better, or other international organizations, is where the way they can have the most influence. So that was really the best, among the very best elements of working in that job. The Economic and Social Council has a very wide charter at the United Nations. It covers pretty much everything from human relations, human rights, to all the UN Development Program, UNICEF, all really the frontline organizations of the United Nations. But in New York, which is really where it's located, the Security Council is still the big game. That's the war and peace arena, and that's where the lead U.S. ambassador spends most of her time. And so to get the attention of the U.S. government to really making the most of the Economic and Social Council is actually kind of tricky. And we haven't really done it very well. And because people vie so competitively for the rotating positions on the Security Council, they're the 5 permanent members, but the rotating memberships, the Economic and Social Council gets a bit lost, and so that's something that I felt we needed to do more with, and we still need to do more with. Otherwise, it becomes kind of a negotiating arena for General Assembly resolutions that pass pretty much every year with a change in a sentence here or there. I found that to be not that compelling, and actually not that valuable. I mean, it's one of the things the United Nations does, but I wasn't as attracted to it as others.
Mhm.
All right, thank you. So you were also elected to serve as the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. So that you work directly with Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. We also want to hear you talk a little bit about that and your experiences in that position.
Sure. So it's really the second time I was asked to start something new in the federal government, and the reason that I was invited to be the first Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations is that I had done something similar to it at the Agency for International Development. I'd started the Office of Transition Initiatives, which is the first office that kind of dealt with the post-conflict, pre-formal development challenge. Some people call that the gap. But this is quite different. Starting something in the State Department, it's a much older, more rigid bureaucracy. And so doing anything new is a really good test, even if you have a strong and really well-respected Secretary of State like Hillary Clinton was at the time. There's still the natural tendencies of careerism and of large bureaucratic institutions is to resist something that's new, especially something that might take the responsibility from existing strongholds. So, but I really had a, I really love the idea of being entrepreneurial, even in a big bureaucratic institution. And one of the things that I say in my book is that if you're going to be good at this work, you not only have to be attracted to policy and to working with other people, but you have to have a perverse fascination with bureaucracies. Because if you don't pay attention to kind of these slow, resistant institutions, you'll never make any progress at all. And I felt the best way to do that in this new position was to really focus our work in 4 countries that really mattered. And so we started working in Syria, which we knew was probably the most volatile place in the Middle East at that time. We looked at Yemen and Egypt, and as well as Libya, but settled on Syria. That became very consuming. The Kenyan elections, they'd had some very, very bad elections where they had lost 1,000 people and hundreds of thousands had left their homes. Honduras, where there was the highest homicide rates outside of a war zone in the world, and also in our border when a few thousand Honduran children showed up in Texas. It paralyzed America for a couple of weeks right at that time. And then Burma, which was trying to develop a new democratic system. So we knew those were places that the regular bureaucracy really cared about. So we wanted to show that we could do new things in a very trustworthy way, that we would bring talent and money to those places that otherwise would not have shown up. And then we would build our reputation by those experiences. And our goal was to really attract 20 career ambassadors so they became big fans of this particular new bureau. We thought if we did that, then we would have the bureaucratic roots that would be impossible to dislodge. And then over time, we could also show a new culture, new ways of doing things. So those are my ambitions, and I think they're underway. It's still difficult. It hasn't succeeded yet, but I think it is seen as a valuable tool in the State Department, at the White House, and our colleagues at AID, at Department of Defense, and other places of that sort.
Staying with that topic of democratic change, what do you think, from your experience, what do you think America's role should be in those transitions to democracies and democratic reforms around the world?
Well, at the simplest way, Vineet, I would say to really support, find, engage, support, and catalyze the local people of places that really need change. Because without the local ownership, it's really hard to make much stick. And I don't feel that we do a good enough job in any of those words of either finding, engaging, mobilizing, supporting. We're weak in every one of those categories. And it does start with how well do we know a place. And one of my favorite thoughts is that there should be a new doctrine that says we should never send a U.S. soldier into a country where we don't know at least 100 people. Now, that doesn't seem like a very complicated test. And it doesn't mean that when we know 101 that we send paratroopers. But if you would use that test, we probably would not be in Iraq, Afghanistan, or would not have gone into Vietnam. Now, after we've been there 18 years, we certainly know 100 people, but this is not the right way to get it done. And so it does start with that modesty and that humility, but it's trust the local people, can catalyze their best instincts.
All right. So we also know that you worked towards a lot of things to do with climate change while you worked for the U.S. government. So how would you view the state of our nation on progress towards climate change now under the administration compared to the administration you work for?
Well, we've actually gone backwards, so it's not good because the problem is moving forward. Now, thanks to this pandemic, and there's not a lot of thanks that you can give to somebody that kills all kinds of people,
Right.
but we're probably getting the biggest pause in our use of fossil fuels in probably in our history since we became dependent upon them. So maybe we'll see some dramatic change, but you wouldn't have beautiful places like that spot behind me if we continue to abuse our human use of this earth. And it just seems to me that it really comes down to a question of greed. I don't know what your grandmother said, but what my grandmother would say was that in our case, for those of us who are of the Christian faith, she would say the Bible doesn't have any problem with money. It's the worship of it that is the problem. And I think we could probably solve a lot of our healthcare crises, our climate crisis, even our racism, if we were not quite so devoted to our worship of the material.
Mm-hmm. And staying with the pandemic, recently the president announced pulling funding from the WHO. And considering how large of a part the U.S. in funding for the WHO, what do you think that could mean as a precedent for future crises?
Well, the United States has, over the last several decades, has pulled money from United Nations organizations. And it's a really crummy model. I mean, we are by far the most powerful member of the United Nations. It's located in New York for a reason, and we have been in many cases the most generous contributor to things like the World Food Program, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, and just about everywhere else. And we pay about 25% of the peacekeeping costs. So we're kind of an anchor of the institution. Generally, when you're the biggest and you also have the most people dedicated to working on these issues, as we do at the State Department or the other parts of the United States government that work through the UN, you have a phenomenal amount of influence if you come with fresh ideas and if you are committed to the mission of the organization. There's nothing about the mission of the WHO that has gotten worse. The idea that we would have an international body that can actually monitor and alert and possibly draw resources to the treatment of outbreaks, health outbreaks, of pandemics, whatever. And almost everybody would say, "Well, what's wrong with that?" So if we've got a problem with it, it's probably because we haven't figured out what we really want from it and how to use it best. And so we are the most dominant member, but that doesn't mean we should be saying, well, we pay the most, so we should have our way. That's a surefire way to lose almost any argument. Now, you can make the argument that the WHO is not courageous enough in standing up to, in particular, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. That would be us, China, Russia, England, or the UK, and France. And I think that's true of a lot of UN agencies. They need to be more courageous in taking us on. I mean, it's not like, so this, in a way, this is a UN moment, but here we get back to the structural problem. There are a lot of people who make their living working at the United Nations, and they hate seeing a pile of money going out the door because it puts them at great personal risk. But hey, you're working for the greater good. You're working on the best causes on earth, which is to fight disease or to fight the abuse of refugees or whatever. So these are moments, these are profiles in courage moments. And I think we not only have to be critical of the United States and this current government, but we also have to try to raise the ambition of our friends in these UN agencies.
All right. Thank you. So let's continue with the coronavirus topic. So how do you think that the coronavirus will affect elections across the country? And then from the youth perspective, what can the youth do to mitigate the negative impacts like we saw with the recent primary, that most of the votes were mail-in order votes, and I think over four.
Mike, my internet connection what became unstable, so I missed that entire question.
Okay, sorry. I'll just repeat it. So continuing with the coronavirus, how do you think the coronavirus will affect elections this November? And sticking with youth, what can you do to mitigate the negative impacts like we saw, I think, in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin primary? Only 15,000 people were able to vote through mail-in order, I think it's called. So, if this were to push through all the way till November, how is it going to affect our country as a whole?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's a really good question. I don't know. I think people are really motivated to vote this year. I hope they are. I think in Wisconsin, there was evidence that of higher turnouts than they had recently. It is an off year, or the timing it wasn't a general election. So, but if people are afraid again, public safety tends to be the leading concept for doing anything else. If people feel afraid, they won't do anything else. So, but they did in Wisconsin, and to their credit, as you can see behind me, I'm from the state of Maine, and Maine has among the most progressive election laws in the country. You can do same-day registration. You can do absentee voting without having to have an excuse. It starts weeks before the election, so that's although they don't mail you the ballots, you have to ask for them. And we have elections at every level. So we end up being one of the highest turnout states in the country every single year. So I believe in the system where you make voting easy and you make it very professional. But there are people here who are in our country right now who are interested in voter suppression because they lack the confidence to take what the voters have to say. Now, I'm one of those people who had to face the voters back when I was a little older than you, and I lost. But I have great respect for sort of the collective judgment that they made. I think I would have been a good congressman. I was maybe a bit too young and maybe a bit too inexperienced. But I think the voters looked at me and they said, he's a promising talent. Let's see what he has to offer in the future. So that meant that they didn't vote for me that time. But I like that. I mean, I like the process. And when you put yourself forward, it's a heck of a scary thing to do. And there were times that I was really intimidated, but it's also has to be one of the biggest experiences anybody can have in life, whether you're running for school board or whether you're running for president. Any one of those, anytime you put yourself in front of a lot of other people and ask them to support you, you learn a lot. So anyway, I think that the pandemic, if it's used as an excuse to suppress voter turnout, that will be a grotesque insult to the American system.
Also, staying with your run for Congress early on, how are young people involved in your campaign? And today, how do you think young people should get involved in elections and in the political process?
Well, I love having young people involved in campaigns, and I also in my work, I always cite youth as one of the significant elements of this of the silenced majority. There's a group of people, usually women and young people, is where I start, who are not part of the decision to go to war or not part of the peace negotiations, and yet they are oftentimes the fodder of those efforts. And so I'm a big fan of respecting young people and of finding real responsibilities. And in my campaign, because I was so young, I didn't exactly attract the establishment. So I had to go speak at high schools and junior high schools. And actually I had learned that in my very first campaign, the first campaign I worked on, because I was working for a congressman who was running against an iconic U.S. Senate member. So I was working for Bill Hathaway, who was a representative against Senator Margaret Chase Smith, the only woman member of the Senate. And she was so established, we couldn't get anybody who had been around quite a while to work on the campaign. So my core campaign volunteers were pretty much junior high school people, and I was 1 year out of college, so we were just about the same age. And it was spectacular how how much work we could get done, and how many doors we could knock on, and how many other people, their parents and others, we could get involved just by bringing young people. So in my own campaign, just to give you one example, I talked to a former governor, and he said, if you're going to win this important southern county, York County, it's the part of Maine that borders New Hampshire, so closest to Boston. You should try to get this one family. Well, they all saw me, and I had no position. I'd worked on this U.S. senator staff for 2 years, and they thought, why the older politicians in the family thought, why should we support this guy? But I got the son of the mayor of the biggest city there to support me. And he was about my age. And of course, once I had the son, it wasn't going to be long before I almost immediately had his mother, and then his father and his uncle and everybody else came along. It's kind of fun, actually. I was just looking at my birthday calendar, and tomorrow is his birthday. So I'm going to give him a call and catch up with him. But it was really a youth movement. And the difficulty with the youth movement side of it is it's not so good on the fundraising and a few other areas. So I'd have a fundraiser in Washington, and one of my friends who was going to law school invited like 50 people, and I think we raised $300. I wasn't trying to be like Bernie. I would have accepted thousands, but that was, and I remember one guy, one of my biggest contributors to that event, he gave me a check for $25. He so liked what I had to say that he was ready to write another check. And I can remember his wife grabbing his hand and saying, "What are you doing? That's our dinner." So anyway, so there are disadvantages, but at the end of the day, the energy, the enthusiasm, the fresh ideas, the willingness to take risks, those are all natural advantages of working with young people, and it worked for me, and I would recommend it to anybody running for office.
So we do see, like you just mentioned, like the benefits and the advantages of working with the youth in your campaign. It's even something that, like you said, Bernie did through both his campaigns, actually. But one of the things that we both think are the biggest disadvantage when it comes to the primary of your base being the youth is the low voter turnout that happens. Like statistically, especially in today's times, youth voter turnout has been extremely low. So how do you think, why do you think this is, and how do you think we can alleviate this?
Well, I mean, right off the top, it's familiarity. It's obviously something new and something that we haven't all done. But for any of us who've ever gone in to vote, I have one of my favorite pictures in our house. It's not blown up or anything. It's just a little Polaroid shot, but I still love it. Is of going to vote when my daughter was still riding around on my back. So she was probably less than a year old, and coming out of a voting booth with our daughter who was on my back. And so I think just recognizing that not only is it important and you actually have a heck of a lot of influence, but it's easy, it's fun, it makes you feel part of something more important. I mean, so we gotta, not just do the civics side of it. We've got to make it just as something that's really enjoyable as well. So familiarity is the first part of it. Then I think there's a default position that people get into when they don't really understand their influence or their own impact, and it can be a little bit cynical, which is, hey, why bother? It doesn't make any difference. They are all the same. I mean, a variation of those. Well, they're not all the same. It's not even close in many, many, many elections. Sadly, that attitude has let small numbers of people take over oftentimes the internal selection process. And it's not the bosses of old, but it's just highly motivated voters who may be angry about something. And so I think we really got to work at that. And as a candidate, I worked at it. And then I was also party chairman. And I one of the things I tried to do as a party chairman in Maine was that I wanted to make our convention, our state convention, the biggest state convention ever. Because I figured, heck, if you had more people showing up, that's more people who think of themselves as active Democrats. So why not do that? So, but then we also, okay?
Yeah.
Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So we didn't have, I don't know where so and that meant that we had to have a big caucus process. So we had to have a lot of people show up for the caucuses. That was fine. We did that pretty well. Even though it was a presidential year. So that helped us get people out for the caucuses. But then, for example, we put out a convention magazine, and that was one of our few popular fundraising ways that we could make a little money. But the way we made money is we told anybody who advertised, that we would distribute it to every registered Democrat in the state of Maine. What that meant that suddenly, instead of just talking about people who show up in primaries or come to caucuses, that we mailed it to every single Democrat who was registered in the state. And we treated them as if they were part of our party, even though most of them were barely thought of themselves as Democrats. Well, that then created an association, a relationship. And anybody who gave even $1 got a handwritten thank you card from me, the state party chairman. So again, we just were trying to just make it come together as much as possible. And we were very, very lucky. We had the Senate Majority Leader at that time, George Mitchell. He was a terrific public servant, and he had been a party chair many years before. And he became a lead advertiser in that magazine, or he gave us extra money to collect the voting list, because then he could use them in the election. So we had all that stuff computerized. So again, whatever you can do to go out and embrace people and make them feel like they're part of something that's important. So it's not just a question of saying the door is open and we're inclusive. You've really got to show the love. And if you show the love, whether you're a business or a political candidate or a student in a professor's class.
Just a final question. If you could you talk a little bit about your work, your book, and then other things you're currently doing at Princeton as a lecturer as well?
Yeah, let's look at. I wish you had a clock behind your head there, so I could not just ramble on here.
There's a clock. 4 minutes 39 seconds. I think our remaining meeting time is.
All right, so let me see if I can give you some quick answers. I mean, look, I just feel really blessed to have been able to work in over 40 conflict zones, mostly supported by U.S. taxpayers, but also in the United Nations, trying to make the world more peaceful. I mean, it doesn't get a lot better than that, that you actually have a paying job that allows you to try to do good. And I love the people that I worked with. I loved the people in the countries that I worked with. They're people in a war zone. They're really not that different than the rest of us, other than they're much, much more. It's a much scarier environment, but their ambitions for themselves and for their families are so similar to ours that if you have an ounce of empathy and you have any degree of curiosity about the human condition, this is pretty spectacular work. It doesn't get a lot better, and that's why I'd have really successful people who are already multimillionaires at Microsoft coming to us at UNHCR and asking what could they do to help because they needed more meaning in their lives. Okay, so there's the balance. So this is incredibly meaningful work, and one of the tests that I would give myself is, okay, you got the big picture, you're trying to do something that's hugely important, great, but what's a practical first step that you that's tangible, that the people of a country can grab hold of, and that it addresses something that they have cited as a real need from day one. So it's not something, I didn't want to come in with my warehouse full of existing ideas or answers. I want to hear what people have got to say. I want to really process it. I want to hear it many times, so it's not just, I just talked to the smartest guy in the country and he told me what to do. I want to hear it at a lot of different levels and from a lot of different kinds of people, young people, women in particular, for example. So it's spectacular work. Now what I'm doing at Princeton is I'm teaching this, and my book was an opportunity not to write a memoir, but to suggest ways that we could do this work much, much, much better, and to show clear examples. So it's a lot of stories of, oh, so you have that problem in Kenya. It looks like they might be leading up to a new election that could be very violent. How about if we do these following things? Again, initiated by Kenyans and our willingness to sharpen the idea, to bring them resources or whatever. So the other thing I'm doing at Princeton is with my wife, we're co-directors of a program called Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative, SINCE program. And that's an effort to get the most talented Princeton students to work in the federal government. And so we select interns each summer, and we also have fellows, extremely generous fellowship, pays for full graduate school, 2 years at the Woodrow Wilson School, and then pays for 2 years of working inside the federal government. So these people get paid, these incredibly talented and wonderful students get paid for 4 years to get their MPA and to do 2, 3, or 4 rotations in the federal government where they really get to know it. So it's really kind of a wonderful way to continue it. What I'm doing with my book is I'm speaking around the country wherever I get invited, and I just finished doing Texas, Alabama, North Carolina, and Arizona, and so there are parts of the country I still haven't been to. So if you can give me invitations to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, then we will have done a pretty good. I will have done a pretty good job of trying. I thought I was inside of 4 minutes, but apparently not.
All right, so just you can spend some more time now if you want to elaborate on it, but you can continue off where you left off.
No, I think I was really at the end. So it's really now my major responsibilities are getting out and trying to engage the American public and then pass the word to these Princeton students. Froze my screen. My screen, every so often I get this internet connection is unstable, and I usually lose either the hearing or the voice. Did that come through?
Yeah, it came through.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So no, I'm pretty well. That's what I think I needed to say, and happy to answer another question or two. But thank you as well for that enjoyable conversation.